Thanks, David, for the kind words. Thanks for all of you. It's beautiful outside. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the following. I want to first just talk very briefly about social media, but how we think about it as political scientists, which I'll talk about social media data, and politics. Then what I'm going to spend the bulk of the time doing is giving you some quick, brief examples of some of the work we've done in the SMAP lab about the relationship between social media and politics over the last few years. And in particular, I'm going to talk to you about hate speech on Twitter. I'm going to talk to you about who shared fake news on Facebook, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Russian troll behavior in the 2016 US elections. When we think about social media data, when we think about social media as social scientists, we think about it in two different ways. We can think about social media data as a variable. So in that sense, it's how does social media impact politics? So in the SMAP lab, this is one of the big questions we're interested in. Like, what is the impact of social media on politics? What's the impact of using social media on your likelihood to participate in politics? How does having leaders who use social media change politics? How do regimes respond to online opposition? But we also have thought about social media as data. And for those of us who are social scientists, the rise of social media data presents unprecedented opportunities to study social and human behavior. That's what we do. We try to study social and human behavior. For political scientists, we want to understand politics. For other people, want to study the economy, society. But the rise of social media has changed the amount of data that we have at our disposal. All of the research that we produce in the SMAP lab is set up like a lab. Even though we're in a political science department, we have an organization that looks more like a natural sciences lab. So we have PIs, we have postdocs, research engineers, PhD students doing research, undergraduates who do research with our team and play a big role in our team, and I'll come back to that at the very end. If you were following the 2016 US elections, you might have seen headlines like this. You might have seen things about hate speech seeps into US mainstream campaign, and in particular things like massive rise in hate speech on Twitter during the presidential elections. So we set out in the SMAP lab to figure out, did this actually occur? Right? We went out to see, could we actually document this beyond just lots of different anecdotal observations of it? So the research question was, to what extent did online hate speech and white nationalist rhetoric and Twitter increase over the course of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and in the aftermath of his election? Now, we got definitions for hate speech, so we define hate speech in a particular way, we define white nationalist language in a particular way, and then we thought, okay, so if these claims were all right, hate on the rise after Trump's election, Donald Trump and the escalation of hate, what would we look at? What would we be able to see if we went into the real world? Well, if we could measure the prevalence of hate speech online, and if we could look at time, and if we think about the x-axis here as time, and we think about this line as election day, all these arguments about hate speech increasing over the course of the election campaign would either predict something like this was going on, right? That Trump declares, he uses different language and people are used to it, legitimizes it, kind of feeds on itself. So if it really increases over the cuts, it could go up like this. Or maybe what people were talking about was something that looked more like this, that the election of Donald Trump legitimates using this kind of language, and there's a surge in hate speech after the election. But if those claims were describing what was happening, it would probably be something like this or something like this. So what do we do to test this? Well, we gathered two types of data sets. One we call our political Twitter data, which was tweets that mentioned either Hillary Clinton or Hillary Clinton slogans, and tweets that mentioned either Donald Trump or Donald Trump slogans. And this gave us, we looked at a 2-year period from like basically the day Trump declared in 2015 until the summer of 2017. And this gave us about 750 million tweets. We also, however, looked at a random sample of American Twitter users. So maybe there was something peculiar about the political data, but what about people tweeting in general? So we had been following a random sample of 500,000 American Twitter users, collecting everything they were tweeting about, and that gave us another 400 million tweets. All right, so then we had 1.2 billion tweets to look at over a 2-year period, billion with a B. So how are we going to do this? So we used two different methods. The first was a dictionary-based method. We took words that people had associated with hate speech. But it turns out if you do that, there's actually an awful lot of false positives you're going to get. Because people will say things like, Trump has a chink in his armor, right, over foreign policy. That word is included in an anti-Asian hate speech dictionary, but that's not a hate speech sentiment. Or you would have people saying things like, I can't believe I was called X, right? That's not hate speech, that's against hate speech. So we have to train machine learning models to remove the false positives. And then we came up with a whole new method, which is we were afraid that, well, we had these dictionaries of hate speech that had been used in offline speech. Maybe they weren't right for the way people talked about things online. So we came up with a whole other method, which we used sophisticated machine learning models, similar to neural nets, to essentially try to find a place where we knew there was hate speech online, which turned out to be certain corners of Reddit. For those of you who are familiar with Reddit, there were subreddits that are organized around these topics. And then we were able to compare how much the Twitter data we saw every day kind of looked like it was similar to that online data. All right. The key was both of these methods allowed us to measure change over time in the prevalence of hate speech, which is exactly what we needed to sort of test these assertions. So this is the sort of raw data that we have everything kind of pooled together across the Clinton data set, the Trump data set, and the random sample data set. And this is the proportion of tweets, but we also did this all sorts of other different ways as well, where we did it with numbers of tweets and everything. It makes no difference. And what you see is essentially kind of flat. You don't really see changes here. You see a little burst here in January and February of 2017. That turns out to be around the Muslim travel ban. And a lot of that is misogynistic speech aimed at Sally Yates, who was the Assistant Attorney General there, who resigned as part of that process, or was fired as part of that process. This is what it looks like when you disaggregate it. Here what we're doing is we're breaking this out in terms of one of the more depressing things I've done in my career: anti-Asian hate speech, anti-black hate speech, anti-immigrant, et cetera. And what you see across here is the pattern that we found across all of this data, no matter how we looked at it. It's that we do not see a trend up like we saw in either of those things. We do not see a huge shift after the election. What we see is burstiness. So this, for example, is anti-Muslim hate speech. And this is where the Bataclan nightclub shooting took place in Paris. So after this terrorist attack, there was a surge of anti-Muslim hate speech. But then it re-equilibrates back down to the trend level. To be clear, I'm not saying anything normatively good or bad about this, right? You might think that the trend level is way too high, and you might think that the trend level is not that high. But the point is, when we looked across all of these things, that contrary to received wisdom, our analysis did not show a systematic increase in hate speech over the course of the campaign or after the election, nor did we find this for white nationalist rhetoric. Instead, what we found was this was bursty. Now, here's another thing that we were sort of got interested in testing what people were saying. If you were following, again, closely the 2016 election, you may not have been paying attention and discovered the fact that actually Pope Francis had shocked the world by endorsing Donald Trump over the course of the election, or that WikiLeaks confirmed that Hillary sold weapons to ISIS, right? So this is what is now known as the sort of famous fake news that emerged over the course of the 2016 election. Some of the admitted students here might know that the response to fake news in the 2016 election has been a rise of literacy classes, digital literacy classes in high schools. So, okay, on the assumption that younger people may be sharing fake news. So we set out to see, could we figure out after the election who was sharing fake news? We were very fortunate that we had in the field at the time of this election, three-wave panel survey that we had fielded in 2016 for 3,500 people, where we included a Facebook app, and we built an app with the cooperation with Facebook that allowed participants in our survey to share their Facebook data with us if they wanted. But then here's the big finding we found, which is that it turns out that people who were over age 65, on average, shared 7 times as much fake news as the class of 2023 here at NYU. So the big takeaway from this is, you know, the kids are all right? We blame millennials for a lot of things. And I'm a big fan of teaching digital literacy in high schools. I think it's incredibly important. But digital literacy in high schools is not going to be the policy solution that gets us out of this situation. The greatest collection of data we've ever had in the history of the world for studying social and human behavior will be put to one purpose, and that will be maximizing revenues for giant multinational corporations, right? So we live in a world, and most likely we have to assume it may get into the hands of security services as well, but it won't get into the hands of people like me who have to go through IRB reports and transparency and everything we do with data. So one thing I want you to take out of this when you go back home and you're thinking about it and hearing these sort of privacy arguments, is that we do live in a world where this is a trade-off. Right? If you go on one extreme, I would never have been able to show you any of this stuff today, and we wouldn't have learned these things, and it wouldn't be in the public domain. Facebook might know it, but you wouldn't, right? So it's a trade-off between privacy versus what public good. And I'm not telling you where you should fall on that, but I want people to think of it as in that regard. So thank you very much. You can find more about the SMAP Lab here at smapnyu.org, and I'm looking forward to your questions.